So good evening, everyone. On behalf of the N.K. Dawar Cancer Foundation, I would like to invite all of you to this webinar today on colorectal cancer. I am Dr. Khurshid Mistry. I'm a trustee of the N.K. Dawar Cancer Foundation, and I head OnCare, which is a cancer wellness and palliative care center started by N.K. Dawar. So what is our mission? Our mission of N.K. Dawar is an endeavor to promote and integrate cancer treatment for every patient, whether they are curable, palliative, or terminal, as we believe that every person has a right to live with care and dignity at any stage of cancer. Some of our objectives are primarily to provide financial assistance for cancer treatment, to spread awareness and help in the early detection of cancer, to strengthen the existing cancer treatment facilities, providing palliative and terminal cancer care, to promote research in cancer, and to interact with national, international, government, professional bodies, and other NGOs. Primarily, what we do can be classified under four basic objectives. One is the detection and awareness. Second is the assistance, financial assistance, educational activities such as what we are witnessing today, and cancer wellness and palliative care through OnCare. So just a glimpse of what we have already achieved in terms of the detection and awareness. We have been across India, from the rural villages to some of the really backward areas of Jharkhand and other states, distant states like Gujarat, UP, and throughout our aim is to screen, create awareness, and detect patients as early as possible. Once we have detected them, we do not leave them to the mercy of nothing. We do manage to get them to Bombay and give them the required treatment. In terms of financial assistance, to date, we have supported over 30,000 patients in the form of assistance with chemotherapy, other supportive medicines, nutrition, and even for other treatments and diagnostics. Educational activities, as I said, such as these, we have conducted several webinars throughout this lockdown period, prior to which we used to conduct the CMEs in actual physical presence. But currently, because of seeing the current scenario, we have adapted and we have now taken over through webinars like what we are witnessing today. The Wellness and Palliative Care Center is what is called OnCare. We are situated at the Masina Hospital, and we have an extremely holistic approach to provide palliative care to our cancer patients. So coming to today's webinar, our focus is going to be on the current trends in the management of colorectal cancer. And there's going to be a slight shift in the program agenda, as you have seen. We'll be starting with the screening for colorectal cancer by Dr. Delnaz Dabar. Dr. Delnaz is an MD internal medicine from D.Y. Patil Medical University, Mumbai, and she has worked as a consultant at the Primary Healthcare Center at Surat. Her topic for today is going to be screening for colorectal cancer. So with great pleasure, I'd like to invite Dr. Delnaz.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Khurshid, for your kind words. I, Dr. Delnaz, today will be talking on a topic of screening of colorectal cancer with a little touch on its epidemiology, as well as what are the different types of screening methods and why is it important. Starting with our very first, yet a basic slides, which says what is screening. Cancer screening refers to performing a test or an examination of asymptomatic individual with an aim to diagnose and prevent death and suffering from the disease in question through early therapeutic intervention. These are following few requirements which must be met for screening to be effective. Starting with, the disease burden is significant. Natural history of disease should have detectable preclinical phase, which says we must have a longer duration from onset of disease to the patient having a symptoms for the disease. For this, we must have a proper test and procedures which must detect cancer at a pre-symptomatic phase and a treatment which can improve the patient's outcome. As you can see, these are the magnitudes of problem. As noticed in year 2020, the maximum highest numbers of cases were for breast cancer, followed by lung cancer, and the third most common was colorectal cancer. The mortality rates were highest with lung cancer and followed by colorectal cancer. Giving a little idea about pathophysiology of CA colon, as it has an implication on which stage, which screening method, and when to start with the screening methods. As we can see, it starts with a normal epithelium of a colon, which with a period of time changes into abnormal epithelium in a hypoproliferative phase, which creates an adenoma, which are precancerous ones, and later makes it cancerous by the span of 10 to 15 years. Hence, patient has a long pre-symptomatic phase, and to diagnose them at an early stage is important. Anything left unattended later with years changes into carcinomas. CA colon was considered a cancer of a developed nation with an affluent population. However, has now increasing in a developing countries like India due to conditions like unhealthy lifestyle choices like consumption of calorie-rich diet, low fiber diet, excessive red meat consumption, and physical inactivities. As we can see from 2004 to 2014, there is rise of 20% of cases in India for CA colon. As we can see, Mumbai has 20.4% rise with the cases. It is the second leading cause of cancer there and a third most common cancer in men and women. Early colon cancer usually, as discussed, has no symptoms, usually is diagnosed at an advanced cancer stage and is one of the most preventable cancer form because it is lifestyle associated. Henceforth, screening is important. Not only colon screening detection, but can also help it for a precancerous polyp. The randomized trial has shown endoscopic polypectomy reduces the mortality to 20%. The types of screening methods are being divided from a stool-based, a direct visualization, and a serology-based test. For a stool-based, first and the commonest method used was Guaiac FOBT test, that is fecal occult blood test. The Minnesota colon cancer study, which was done in 1976 till 1978, used FOBT as a first method for screening cancer. In this, 46,551 adults were taken as a participants in 3 arms of annual FOBT, biennial screening, or a usual care. A rehydrated Guaiac test was used. With 13 years of follow-up, there was 33% reduction in a patient who had annually been screened than a usual care group, which at that time means a no screening or no test was done. With an 18 years follow-up, the biennially screened group had 21% of reduction in mortality. Other international studies are Nottingham FOBT study, which had total 156 participants, age of 50 to 74 years, shows 13% reduction when given 8 years follow-up with FOBT screening, whereas Danish FOBT study showed 18% reduction with 10 years of follow-up in 62,000 participants who were from 45 to 74 years of age. Coming to our next test, which is fecal immunochemical test. These are the stool tests that reacts to human hemoglobin and do not react to dietary products. They have a higher sensitivity and specificity and also has no dietary or medication restrictions. As you can see, these are the kits used. Henceforth is more user-friendly test than the previously used Guaiac FOBT test, and it can be done at home as well. Coming to our direct visualization test, which we have first is a flexible sigmoidoscopy. As we can see and have discussed prior, for a pathophysiology, forming an adenoma till the patient develops symptoms, it nearly takes 5 to 15 years of time which gives us a long period for patient to detect. Hence, FOBT tests can only be used in a patient with a preclinical stage or in a symptomatic stage. Henceforth, endoscopic screening is important. Early diagnosis of adenoma gives us an early idea for CRC patient and can treat in a better outcome. But the restriction to this sigmoidoscopy is it can only examine till rectum and sigmoid colon. Estimated that flexible sigmoidoscopy can find 60 to 80% of cancer and polyps which are found by colonoscopy. In a randomized trial, it is shown that sigmoidoscopy can reduce 18% of incidence, whereas 28% reduction in mortality. As we can see, randomized prospective trials were done where there was a reduce in 23% incidence with a reduction of 31% in mortality rate, and National Cancer Institute, which did trial for prostate, lung, colon, and ovarian cancers, shown 21% reduction in incidence and 26% reduction with mortality rate. Coming to our very important test for the screening method of CRC is colonoscopy. It becomes a preferred screening method in United States, UK, and India, though there have been no prospective randomized trial for this test. Sigmoidoscopy studies indirectly support efficacy of colonoscopy screening. The best support for this screening was Minnesota colon cancer study, which we saw. It required that all the participants who had a positive stool blood test have diagnostic imaging of entire colon. More than 40% those screened annually eventually went through colonoscopy. Any patient with positive FOBT, FIT, fecal DNA test, or any patient with positive FOBT eventually goes into diagnostic colonoscopy. However, there are few limitations to this test as well. That is our bowel preparation, bowel perforation, cost of the procedure, and a limited numbers of physicians in rural areas. Coming to CT colonography, this allows physicians to visually reproduce endoscopic examination on a computer screen. The preparation, however, is as same as colonoscopy, but is less invasive. It has a higher compliance rate. The disadvantages, it requires the same colonic preparation, requires a follow-up diagnostic colonoscopy, and the major is a rate of extracolonic finding of certain significance is high and each must be evaluated, leading to additional expense and potential morbidity. Coming to capsule endoscopy, as seen in the picture, these are the capsule which has a tiny camera in the front, the wireless one, which passes through a transverse colon and take a picture from it. This is approved by FDA, however, is not a screening option itself. It requires a bowel preparation, but no sedation, dietary or medication adjustment is required. It does not allow a biopsy or polyp removal during the test. Disadvantage is it can be difficult in swallowing, may be lost, may not get a proper diagnosis by this capsule. Another coming to a last types are a blood-based markers. This detects CRC generally at a very advanced stage rather than a precancerous lesion. However, these are still under a major trial. Those are SEPT9 and 7-gene biomarker tests. Current recommendations by American Cancer Society shows an adult being screening at the age of 45 years. Modality should be chosen based on personal preference and access. The considered options are annual high sensitivity FOBT and FIT multi-target stool DNA testing every 3 years, flexible sigmoidoscopy every 5 years, colonoscopy every 10 years, double contrast barium enema every 5 years, CT colonography every 5 years. No test is equivocally superior. Patient preference should be incorporated in screening in order to increase compliance. It also says single screening examination is far more optimal and there should be a regular program carried out for the screening. Coming to US Preventive Service Task Force recommendations, which takes age of 50 to 75 years. Options available includes high sensitivity stool-based methods every year, FIT, DNA stool testing every 1 or 3 years, colonoscopy every 10 years, CT colonography every 5 years, flexible sigmoidoscopy every 5 years, and flexible sigmoidoscopy every 10 years with FIT every year. Overall, if we see, as we discussed, these are the patients when come for the screening can be divided into average risk or an increased risk patient. Increase are those patients who has a personal history or a family history. Family history are those patients which have a genetic syndromes or have a hereditary history of first relative being positive for CRC, or any of the first relative with a less than 60 years age had an adenomatous polyps. Eventually, genetic people goes for a genetic counseling for the screening test, same like colonoscopy, they have to go with the same hereditary. They can do colonoscopy, FOBT test as given by the guidelines for the screening. Average are those patients less than 50 or above 50. Above 50 years, patient has a screening options of FOBT test, flexible sigmoidoscopy, or double contrast barium study every 10 years and colonoscopy every 10 years. Any of the tests coming positive, eventually with the for the diagnosis, patient goes under colonoscopy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Delnas, for a very concise and talk on a very important topic on screening. So we move on now to our next speaker, who is none other than Dr. Baman Dabar. Dr. Dabar is a senior consultant medical oncologist associated with several hospitals such as the Jaslok Hospital, Wockhardt, Fortis, Breach Candy. In addition to which, he also has his own daycare centers, which are called the BND Onco Center, and they are situated at Dadar and Masina Hospital. Dr. Dabar has passed MD Internal Medicine from Mumbai University in 1988, and after which he has pursued super specialization in medical oncology and hemato-oncology at the Tata Memorial Hospital. Dr. Dabar has several publications, international as well as national, and has also presented at various conferences. And today he will be talking about the strategy to targeting the immune resistance and the novel therapy in colorectal cancer. So over to you, Dr. Dabar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khurshid, and thank you for giving me this invitation. So, today, what I'll be speaking to you are just mainly the novel therapies. I don't think so there are really many novel therapies that are there, but it will be mainly a lecture on how do we treat patients with metastatic colorectal cancer and what are the upcoming therapies which we should be using more often than what we are using in practice. And after a very good lecture of screening by Dr. Delnas, we know that the incidence of colorectal cancer is on the decline. The incidence and the rate of pickup is much higher if one adheres to the screening programs. Colorectal cancer, 25% of the patients of colorectal cancer are diagnosed with metastasis. Whereas 20% of the cases may develop metastasis during the course of their treatment. And once we know that the disease has metastatized to different parts of the body and it is not curative by surgery, it becomes a palliative treatment. You know, colorectal cancer is more common in men than in women. The common sites of metastasis are liver, lung, lymph nodes, and peritoneum. For a metastatic disease, the 5-year survival drops to 12%. However, if a metastatic disease is oligometastatic, and if we can use some form of local therapy to this oligometastatic disease, and at the same time use some systemic therapy, we do see long-term results. So it's a combination of local, and this is just an older data. Dr. Delnas has showed us the recent data, so I won't go into it. So the aims of treatment for a metastatic disease, like in any other malignancy, is to decrease the tumor bulk, produce a maximum tumor shrinkage, suppression of further tumor spread and growth. And how do this in colorectal cancer? We have chemotherapy, we have targeted therapies, we have two broad outline targeted therapies, the VEGF and the EGFR base, and of course now we have got BRAF and HER2, and I'll be talking to you in my subsequent slides. We have the recent child, the immunotherapy is one of the very important therapeutic armamentarium. And as I told you, some forms of local therapy if we use in oligometastatic disease. So coming to chemotherapy, once there were arguments between single agent or multi-agent, but now it is very clear cut that it's a multi-agent. Combination chemotherapy remains the gold standard for physically fit and patients with good performance status. Of course, for patients with poor performance status, one has to see single agent is good enough. And we have seen by using properly sequencing the chemotherapy regimens, even in a metastatic disease, we can push the overall survival to almost 20 months. Now coming to targeted therapies are those type of therapies which target the disease. They inhibit the cell proliferation, the differentiation, and the migration. They induce the microenvironment of the tumor in such a way that it impedes the tumor growth by cutting off the blood circulation and at the same time causing a stronger immune surveillance. Many of the malignancies hide from our immune systems. So producing a stronger immune surveillance and making the immune cells act on the tumor. Many of them are just small molecules and are oral forms of treatment. So these are the different types of targeted therapies, but what we have right now in practice as a first line are the VEGF and the EGFR base targeted drugs. So coming to EGFR and the EGFR related pathways that we have, we know that EGFR pathway is a broad terminology in that we have the HER2 family also and the EGFR family also. And here, as you can see, the EGFR, it begins from a receptor which has got extracellular component and intracellular. In the intracellular component is the enzyme called tyrosine kinase. So when a ligand comes in touch with the receptor, there is a downstream signaling. And when this downstream signaling goes into the nucleus is told to proliferate, differentiate, survive, and invasion, which are the prerequisites of a cancer. So this pathway is more functional usually in cancer patients. The overexpression of this EGFR is most commonly seen in patients with non-small cell lung cancer and a small percentage of patients with colorectal cancer also. Another pathway which is more functional in breast cancer patients, but in a small percentage of patients it is positive in gastric and colorectal cancer also. So if we have to block this pathway, extrinsically it's by MAP. We have two MAPs, panitumumab and cetuximab, to block this pathway. And once this pathway is blocked, the cell signal doesn't go to the nucleus. And in fact, what produces apoptosis, decrease in the metastasis, and good results, that is good tumor shrinkage. So to block this pathway extrinsically, we have two drugs. We have cetuximab and we have panitumumab. This pathway, even if we block, but sometimes what happens, the downstream signal, which is the RAS, RAF, MEK, and ERK, what happens that if there are RAS mutations here, there's a continuous downstream signaling which occurs, which is called as constitutive activation of the pathway, which results in cell growth and proliferation. So even if you use cetuximab, panitumumab, it doesn't work. There is a RAS mutation. So that is the basics of using EGFR drugs. If there is a RAS mutation, the EGFR, the monoclonal antibody cetuximab and panitumumab do not work because of the constitutive reactivation of the whole pathway due to RAS mutations. We have another pathway, the BRAF pathway, and fortunately now we have got drugs to block this pathway also. As I told you, the HER2 pathway, which is a subgroup of the EGFR family, it does not have a direct ligand, although it has a ligand for the HER3, but there is homodimerization which occurs, which causes downstream signaling, and pathway gets activated. And I'll show you that we have now drugs for those patients who have an activated HER2 pathway in patients with colorectal cancer also. This pathway, as we know, is much more functional in patients with breast cancer. So now coming to how do we treat our patients of metastatic colorectal cancer who comes and sits in front of us? We have to make several thoughts in our mind. What is the patient's characteristics? What are the comorbidities? What is the age of the patient? What is his performance status? What prior adjuvant therapy he has received? Because many of, as I tell you, 25% of the patient will develop metastasis during the course of the time. So 25% of the patient may have, more number of patients might have received adjuvant therapy. So what adjuvant therapy they have received? Tumor characteristics. What is the tumor burden? Is it going to be resectable at any point of time? Do we want fast control of the disease? What is the tumor location? Because nowadays, of course, we have drugs depending on the tumor location on the right or the left. What are the molecular characteristics of the tumor? As I told you, which pathway is functional? I told you about the RAS, BRAF, HER2, and of course the MSI high pathway. Means when there is MSI high, we use immunotherapy, which I'll show in my subsequent slides. And of course, quality of life is the most important thing. What our patient wants. And the toxicity profile. What was the toxicity of the previous treatment? Most of the time we use oxaliplatin, and many of our patients have persistent peripheral neuropathy because of the oxaliplatin that we use. So ultimately, the therapy is not a straightforward thing. It has to be tailored according to the individual patient needs. So as I told you, these are the different pathways which are functioning. And how do we know which pathway is functioning in our patient? So at the time of diagnosis, when the tumor tissue is in front of us, what we do, we send the paraffin block. Or first thing at the time of diagnosis, what we are supposed to send is for what is called as all-RAS. And these are the NCCN guidelines, they say. And BRAF, we have to send at the time of diagnosis. Now at the time of diagnosis, we have to send the tissue for MSI-MMR also. And these are all done on the biopsy piece that is on the paraffin block. And these are the different techniques by which we do. The KRAS, all-RAS is done by next generation sequencing. BRAF is done for NG by NGS. MSI-MMR is done by IHC. These are all NGS. HER2 is another pathway which I told you, which is more functioning in breast cancer patient, but in a small percentage of colorectal cancer patients also is there. It is generally done after failure of first line of therapy. And of course, we have got NTRK fusion, for which we have now different drugs. And this also has to be done after failure of first line of therapy. So this is the time when we should be sending the tissue for different tests before we decide which pathway is functioning and how to use our drugs. As I told you earlier, whenever there is a mutation and there is a downstream signaling which occurs, and hence we can see a panitumumab or cetuximab doesn't work at all. In fact, in a mutated patient, if you see, if we have used panitumumab or cetuximab, the survival is much poor. The PFS is still poorer if we use any of these drugs in a mutated patient. Whereas in the wild type, they show good results. And this is large 3 trials on the basis of which these conclusions are made. So what are the important considerations and when do we use this cetuximab or panitumumab? They are anti-EGFR antibodies. They benefit in left-sided primary. As I told you, RAS or BRAF wild type, they function much better. They show better results. And generally, they are always used with a combination chemotherapy of FOLFOX or FOLFIRI. The VEGF inhibitor, we have bevacizumab, and this bevacizumab can be used in RAS wild type or mutated. It works irrespective of RAS mutation. And of course, I will show in my subsequent slides that bevacizumab works better for right-sided, whereas EGFR drugs are better for left-sided tumors. So there are some contraindications of VEGF. That is whenever the patient has a recent episode of arterial thromboembolism in the past 6 to 12 months, we don't use them. Or when there are untreated hemorrhagic brain mets. Now we have these 2 basic targeted drugs, cetuximab and bevacizumab. Cetuximab, as I told you, is against the EGFR family, and bevacizumab is against the VEGF pathway. Now, which drug we start off with? So to answer this question, we had 2 major trials, or rather 3 major trials, and I'll just give you a glimpse of those trials and won't go into the details. This was a trial called the FIRE-3 trial, which is a phase 3 study design. As you can see, this was first line use in all KRAS wild type, and ultimately it was made to all RAS, because KRAS and NRAS is all RAS. So the randomization of fall-free, that is 5-calcium irinotecan with cetuximab, or fall-free with bevacizumab. And in this study, the primary objective was to get a good response rate. However, whatever you use, there was no difference. In the initial study, when they had published the result in 2014, the response rates were similar, whichever you use. But the secondary endpoint was overall survival. And in the secondary endpoint, it was shown that fall-free plus cetuximab had a better and longer overall survival in KRAS wild type of disease. And hence, this study told us that using EGFR-based therapy, that is cetuximab with fall-free, as a first-line therapy would be better than bevacizumab as regards overall survival. This was the conclusion done by the investigators of this FIRE-3 phase 3 randomized trial. And here also we can see a wide difference here. And this was the median overall survival in the RAS wild type, which showed clearly that the survival was better. In fact, there was a post hoc analysis, which was again published after 2 years, in which they showed that the depth of response and the tumor shrinkage was much earlier when we used cetuximab rather than VEGF inhibitors, that is bevacizumab. And they said that these are some of the parameters by which you can judge the responses. So rapid tumor shrinkage and the depth of responses were better, and hence they believed that there is an increased rate of objective responses also, which was better, apart from improvement in overall survival. And hence the conclusion of this study later on was also that maybe these drugs are better than using VEGF inhibitors upfront. The PEAK trial used another EGFR inhibitor called the panitumab, and they used with the regimen of FOLFOX. As you can see, they use panitumab or FOLFOX, again 1:1 clear randomization. And here also they showed by using panitumab, although the PFS was similar, overall survival was better when panitumab was used upfront rather than bevacizumab. So this is a meta-analysis of all the 3 studies, the FIRE-3, the CLGB. The CLGB was very similar to FIRE-3, but it was a larger study, and the PEAK trials. All of these trials, this was a meta-analysis of 2014 patients, where they showed that overall response rate was superior in patients who received first-line anti-EGFR compared to VEGF. At the same time, they also showed the meta-analysis that overall survival when first-line anti-EGFR was used compared to VEGF was better. So these results suggest that anti-EGFR monoclonal antibodies may be a real alternative to anti-VEGF as the initial treatment of advanced colorectal cancer. This was, again, 2 major studies of cetuximab done in patients with metastatic disease, and this was a study in the RAS wild type. And what this study of the FIRE-3, which I had already told you, one of the subgroup analysis showed in both of these studies that left-sided tumors are worse prognostically than right-sided tumors. The left-sided tumor are better than right-sided tumor. The right-sided tumors have a worse prognosis, especially if they are KRAS or all-RAS wild type. And both these studies also showed that cetuximab with fall-free benefited left-sided tumors, whereas for the right-sided tumors, it was mainly bevacizumab. This was again a retrospective analysis of multiple studies, the CRYSTAL, FIRE-3, CLGB, and PEAK studies comparing chemotherapy plus EGFR antibody. It was an experimental arm, and chemotherapy bevacizumab was control arm. And the pooled analysis, that is a retrospective analysis of this multiple studies, have shown that there is a worse prognosis for overall survival, PFS, and overall response rate for patients with right-sided tumors compared with left-sided tumors, and especially if they are RAS wild-type metastatic colorectal cancer. So it is a predictive thing which tells us that right-sided tumors do not do well whatever we do. And greater effect of chemotherapy plus EGFR antibody compared with only chemotherapy or chemotherapy bevacizumab was best in left-sided tumor. That means the left-sided tumor, chemotherapy with anti-EGFR drugs work better than chemotherapy and bevacizumab or only chemotherapy. Nowadays, of course, only chemotherapy is not used frequently. We use one of these, EGFR or anti-VEGF in a metastatic patient. Now coming to second-line treatment, of course, apart from the patient characteristics, which we always think about of our patient, there are other molecular characteristics which we think of before we go on second line. That is, if we have used EGFR-based therapy and the patient the disease has come back, or if we have used VEGF inhibitor and the disease is back. So what are our second line treatment options? In the second line treatment options, these are the main molecular characteristics, apart from, of course, which I told you, the patient characteristics come into the play before we think of what is the best treatment for our patient. So what are the factors which determine us to decide what is the second line treatment? The prior treatment, what was it? VEGF or EGFR inhibitor? How much time we have used VEGF inhibitor? Because VEGF inhibitors have come much before EGFR. So which of the VEGF inhibitor have we used in our treatment? What is the molecular characteristic of the tumor? Is it BRAF or HER2? And of course, the toxicity considerations. The patient is always prime. The patient always many times decides what is the treatment. So in our patient who have suppose the BRAF V600E mutation positive, which I showed you in my previous slides, if there is a BRAF V600, this was a controlled BEACON trial, which is a trial, as you can see here. It was a study, it was a phase 3 randomized study. Of course, there are many controversies associated with these studies. And here we had used patients with BRAF mutant after failure of 1 or 2 regimens. So after failure, when the patients were randomized into anti-BRAF treatment with MAC inhibitor or only anti-BRAF with cetuximab or the standard of care at that time, it was found the triplet gave us the best results. But at the same time, a subsequent study also has shown that the toxicity associated with the triplet, that is using a MAC inhibitor like binimetinib, was higher. And hence now the standard of care continues to be a doublet treatment. Although this study has shown that the triplet had significantly longer overall survival and higher response rate, but a subsequent analysis which was published has also shown that doublet has less of toxicity and very similar control rates. This was after failure of most of the treatment, that is when we have used our usual regimens of FOLFOX, FOLFIRI, and we have used EGFR and VEGF inhibitors. And then our patients, this was a very large double-blind phase 3 control trial where they had used this tablet, as I told you, the TKI inhibitor, oral tablet of regorafenib versus placebo in patients who had progressed on multiple lines of treatment. And in fact, they had progressed within 3 months of the previous therapy, so a very resistant disease. In this also, this tablet, regorafenib, which is a small molecule multi-kinase inhibitor, showed a survival benefit. And hence, this became a potential new line of therapy in this treatment refractory population. As we all know, we have used regorafenib and we all know it's a very toxic treatment because it's just a tablet, but we feel that, oh, it's just a tablet. But this tablet, when given in a full dose, I can tell you most of the time what we have seen, if you have used this drug, within 4 to 7 days, most of them get hand-foot syndrome and the hand and skin starts peeling. So that's why a redosed trial, that was the phase 2 study design was done. And in this study, it was done a very wise treatment and a very wise decision was done that you start off with a lower dose and then slowly build up to 160. And this strategy of weekly dose escalation of regorafenib from 80 to 160 milligram was found to be superior. And the results of this study now says that the new standard for optimizing the results of regorafenib would be to start at 80 milligram and slowly build up the dose to 160. This was again a very good study, I would say, for our Indian patients. This was a study when, earlier I told you that regorafenib was used after failure of EGFR, failure of VEGF, it was used, and there it showed an improvement on overall survival. So why not bring up a regorafenib upfront without prior EGFR use? So this was a group of patients where all lines of chemotherapy were used, but no prior EGFR drugs were used. And here you can see direct randomization, although it was a phase 2 study where they had randomized to regorafenib or bevacizumab use or irinotecan use, and it was direct randomization between regorafenib or cetuximab plus irinotecan, the first line treatment. And if the disease had progressed, those whom regorafenib was used was shifted to cetuximab, and when cetuximab was used, it was when the patient went to regorafenib. And in this, it was very nicely shown that the sequencing of regorafenib followed by cetuximab had a longer overall survival than our current standard of care is we use regorafenib after the use of cetuximab. So this was a phase 2 trial, and I feel this is very relevant for our Indian standards because many of our patients have very difficulty getting cetuximab or panitumumab because of the cost issues. Another drug, which is again an oral form of chemotherapy, that is trifluridine antiparacyl hydrofluoride, TAS-102. This was again after multiple lines of treatment. The TAS-102 is again a tablet, was compared to placebo or best supportive care. And fortunately, in this study also, all patients with refractory colorectal cancer showed that TAS-102 did improve the survival compared to placebo. And this is also an acceptable second line of treatment. Coming to immune checkpoint inhibitors, we know how these drugs work. We have the antigen presenting cell, which is responsible for activating the T cell. However, we know there are breaks. This is the break, the CTLA4 break. So if we use an anti-CTLA4 antibody, the T cell gets activated. And once T cell gets activated, it goes to the tumor cell. But again, on the tumors also, we have another break, the PD-1 and the PD-L1. So we try to remove these breaks. And once we remove these breaks, the activated T cell can act on the tumor cells. So this is the basics of immunotherapy in any patients with malignancy. So there are the cancer cells try to secrete so many things which do not allow the activation of T cells. And this is what we call as the immune escape phenomenon. So we have anti-PD-1 and anti-PD-L1 drugs. And here you can see these are the very commonly used drugs. And most of them are US FDA approved, not necessarily in colorectal cancer, but in multiple malignancies. The drugs which are approved by US FDA in immunotherapy for colorectal are right now pembrolizumab and nivolumab. This was one of the pioneering studies which again changed our whole clinical practice. That was the Keynote 177 study. It was the first line use of pembrolizumab, the immunotherapy, which is anti-PD-1, where freshly cased treatment new, but of course they had to be MSI high because we know MSI high patients only immunotherapy works well. So this was a selected group of patients of MSI high, and where they compared pembrolizumab with investigator's choice of therapy, that was FOLFOX or FOLFI. And the crossover was also allowed, and in this it clearly showed a gross improvement in PFS. As you can see here, 16.5 months for pembrolizumab versus 8.2 months with hazard ratio of 0.6. And because of this study, the US FDA and everywhere, pembrolizumab is now approved as a first-line treatment for those patients who have a MSI high on the tumor tissue. This was with the nivolumab, but as you can see here, it was after one line of treatment, not MSI high patients, histology confirmed recurrent, where nivolumab was used, which is again a PD-1 inhibitor, where nivolumab was used along with nivolumab plus ipilimumab. And here, again, nivolumab showed durable responses, disease control, and even in pre-treated patients. And this was a new standard treatment option for those patients who had received subsequent previous treatment. This was again one of the studies of Keynote 164. And this was again when pembrolizumab was used after first line of treatment. And again, here also, the data was quite encouraging. So maybe first line, and these are multiple studies, as you can see, Keynote 177, CheckMate, and other studies, where these immunotherapy agents, that is pembrolizumab or nivolumab, and these are pembrolizumab studies, where you can see that even it is used in first line or second line, they have shown good responses, good PFS. Of course, in front line, they have shown one of the best results. But as I told you, MSI high occurs in a very small percentage of patients. most of our patients continue to be MSS stable. And what do we do to them? We have to enhance their immunity so that our immune therapy drugs work. It is believed that radiotherapy causes an upregulated expression of tumor-specific neoantigen through cell damage and increased class 1 expression, activating the post-immune responses. So these are some of the ways we try to overcome the immune resistance. There are some studies of bispecific antibodies. Like these bispecific antibodies have a CA-TCB antibody which binds to CA on the tumor cells and CD3 on the T cells, thereby helping the T cells to infiltrate and come to the tumor cells. MEK inhibitors are known to upregulate PD-L1 expression. So there are studies going on for immune checkpoint inhibitors with MEK blockade. And maybe these will be the future of MSI stable patients. So coming to the algorithm, how we treat, of course, this is from up to date, where you can see that if there is a fit patient with good performance status, comorbidities, and if it is an unfit patient, poor performance status with extensive comorbidity, is he going to tolerate our treatment, systemic treatment? Yes. If he is going to tolerate our treatment, this is a clinical judgment that we see with clinical and biochemical parameters. Then what is his MSI status? That is the first thing that we see. We should be seeing. Of course, it's not possible many times in India. If it is MSI state, goes for pembrolizumab monotherapy. If he is not able to do systemic therapy, and these are the patients where single agent chemotherapy could be tried with or without bevacizumab. If he is a fit patient, if he has got MSI high, he goes for pembrolizumab monotherapy. If he is no, then we do all our other studies, as I told you, RAS, is it all RAS, what side of tumor? As I told you, if he's a RAS wild type and if he's left-sided tumor, we would prefer to go for cetuximab or panitumumab with chemotherapy. And especially if you want to downstage the disease rapidly, then this is the therapy. If he is VEGF inhibitors also continues to be our main line of treatment for right-sided tumors, and for left-sided tumors, as I told you, it is mainly EGFR inhibitors along with chemotherapy. I won't go into the details because it's gone and on, and I'm thankful for you for listening to me. To summarize, metastatic CA colon continues to be a very difficult disease to treat. When there is an extensive metastatic disease, we know the survival is limited and it becomes an uncurative disease. However, if our patient has a metastatic disease and he has an oligometastatic disease, and if we use some forms of local therapy along with systemic therapy, we have still long-term survivals. The way to go ahead is in a metastatic disease is chemotherapy and targeted therapy, depending on the site, depending on the mutations, we have to decide. And as I told you, when we use these properly, metastatic disease person can survive, a patient can survive for more than 2 years when using a proper sequencing of these drugs. Further, molecularly directed target therapy is feasible, as I told you, for those patients who have HER2 or BRAF mutations, we can use those drugs and further improve the survival. Immunotherapy is the new child in our armamentarium, and immunotherapy upfront, followed by this, maybe our survival will be much higher, hopefully. So these are some of our current frontiers of therapy in a metastatic CA colon. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dabar. Firstly, for taking time out of your busy schedule, and also for educating our viewers in a nutshell about all the different pathways and all the different treatment options in a metastatic setting for colorectal cancer. So I'd like to now invite my next speaker, Dr. Nilesh Doctor. Dr. Nilesh has been working in the field of hepatobiliary and surgical gastroenterology. He is Director, Surgical Gastroenterology at Jasloke Hospital, apart from which he is also associated with the Bhatia Hospital, the Breach Candy Hospital, and the Sir H.N. Reliance Hospital. Dr. Nilesh has trained for 4 years in general surgery at KEM Hospital, following which he also has a training of 4 years at the Royal Free Hospital in London. And he has also done his fellowship in hepatobiliary surgery at Mayo Clinic. And he's one of the best hepatobiliary surgeons and gastroenterologists of Bombay, and he has received the gold medal in general surgery. So with great pleasure, I'd like to hand over the screen to Dr. Nilesh. And Dr. Nilesh will be talking about the surgical aspects of the treatment of colorectal cancer. So over to you, Dr. Nilesh.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the foundation for inviting me for this talk and for this exciting symposium. And just give me a minute till I start screen sharing. Treatment of colorectal cancer, especially regards to the safe adoption of minimal access procedures in colon cancer. Now, the first lap surgery for colon cancer was performed in 1991, and essentially right-sided colon tumors were first operated upon by the American surgeon, Dr. Jacobs. However, in 1994, there was a series of around 20 patients, of which 5 or 6 patients had recurrence of the tumor at the site of the port. So in the first 5 or 6 years, it was thought that laparoscopic surgery for any cancer should not be done. Till the first trials were begun in both Europe and the US. So the advantage, of course, would be lower pain scores. They would significantly improve short-term outcomes. There's a lower estimated blood loss, shorter length of hospital stay. And after the laparoscopic surgery, even other more advanced minimal access surgeries like robotic surgery or scarless, other types of scarless surgery kind of caught people's fascination and imagination. So first, let's go through what would be the advantages of different minimal access techniques. So as you know, conventionally, whenever you did a right-sided or a left-sided colon resection or rectal cancer surgery, you would have a large abdominal incision, and patients would have trouble from that. It would be wound infections, it would be incisional hernia formation, you could get burst abdomen. So the morbidity of having a large operation or a large scar would involve patients, taking longer time to recover, going back to the normal activities, etc. So when this was first invented for lesser operations like gallbladder and appendix, people felt that if colon surgeries also could be done with more advanced lap instrumentation, it would be, advantageous to patients in terms of less infections, less time to recovery, less time to go back to work, less time to go back to all the normal activities. So this was the advantage. And laparoscopic surgery would be, of course, much less costlier than robotic or other forms of scarless surgery. Robot-assisted, the advantage over the laparoscopic surgery would be there's a 3D vision, a lot of freedom of movement of instrumentation, enhanced ergonomics. There's a tremor filtration. That means the physiological minor tremors that surgeons may have whilst operating is filtered by the robotic device, and you can do much more finer surgery. The disadvantage is that there is a lack of tactile sensation and tensile feedback. It's quite expensive, and there's a limited intercorporeal range of motion. So the operating time becomes quite long, as each step of the operation you have to plan and do separately. The advances after laparoscopic and robotic surgery, there was a further advancement or a movement towards trying to do this laparoscopic surgery through a single port, which is known as single incision surgery, or through trying to extract the instrument, trying to extract the specimen through a natural orifice. So natural orifice specimen extraction or nose began because the incision that you need to make was quite large, and there was a morbidity of that incision. So if you could extract it through a natural orifice, it would reduce the scar on the abdomen. And the last and most advanced method would be to do the entire surgery through a natural orifice. So that's known as NOTES. NOTES is still not evolved well because it's very difficult to introduce 3 or 4 instruments through a natural orifice like the mouth or the vagina or the rectum, and do an entire abdominal surgery through a natural orifice. Whereas natural orifice specimen extraction or nose has become quite popular, where you can remove the specimen either transvaginally or through the anus, and an additional incision on the abdominal wall is not required. So, as I said, the advantages of nodes would be no scar on the abdominal wall, and for sills, there would be just a single incision. So, here you can see a few diagrams of how this is done. So, you can see that after you finish your resection, you can see that in the last part, before the anastomosis is done, the anal margin is everted and the entire specimen is extracted through the anus. So, you don't need to make an abdominal wall cut. Here again, you can see that this is the anal margin. You can see that the specimen with the tumor is being extracted through the anus. And after it is extracted, you staple off the anus, the lower rectum, and prior to doing an anastomosis. So just before you divided this, you introduce your anvil through the anus and push it into the proximal colon so that you're ready for the anastomosis as the last step. You can see here that there's a stapler introduced from the lower end, and this is performing the colorectal anastomosis after the specimen has been extracted transanally. Here again, you can see this is the different methods by which you can extract it transanally. So as I said, it avoids an incision in the abdominal wall, and it is very suited for left-sided colectomies and rectal surgeries, whereas transvaginal extraction is suitable for colorectal, all colorectal procedures, especially right-sided colon surgeries. So here you can see an actual live demonstration of that's the lower rectum, that's the colon, that's the specimen in between which has already been extracted and put in a plastic bag. You can see here that the anvil has been taken out through the lower rectum and put into the proximal rectum. And you can see here, after the specimen has been extracted through the lower rectum, you can see this lower rectum is open here. And once you have pushed the specimen bag into and removed it through the lower rectum from below, you staple this off. So you can see this lower end of the anus, the lower rectum has been stapled off, and there is a stapler bit here and the anvil here, which will now be joined. So the proximal colon will be joined to the lower rectum to finish off the anastomosis at the end of the operation. So this is a kind of flowchart telling us what kind of operations are suitable. And as you know, in India, many of these lesions are T4 lesions, and these may not be actually suitable for specimen extraction through the lower end, nor could they even be suitable for laparoscopic or minimal access surgery. So you need to choose your patients well prior to doing any surgery. For rectum, that has become quite easy because the majority of the patients with rectal cancer, if they're more than T2, they anyway deserve to have neoadjuvant treatment with chemotherapy and radiotherapy. So there the lesions have shrunk prior to doing any surgery. Whereas if you have colon tumors which are large, it's important that you, or if it's a very obese patient, you can see that BMI is also an indication whether you would do a lap or open resection in these patients. So it's important to choose your patients well before you choose laparoscopic or open surgery. So what changed things? The things that changed dramatically in colon cancer surgery were the trials that began in both in North America as well as in Europe in the late 90s. So as I said, initially when there was a worry about port site recurrences and people had almost kind of all over the world given up doing this, two big trials, one initiated by the Mayo Clinic group by Heidi Nelson, and one initiated by the Swedish group in Europe. So the American trial was called the COST trial. Essentially, it was initially only for patients who had colon cancer. They excluded patients with rectal cancer. And the COLOR trial, the COLOR 1 trial, which was started by the Swedish group, it was a multi-center trial with more than 30 centers. Similarly, the COST trial in North America was also a multi-center trial. Both published in New England Journal of Medicine. So they accrued patients over a period of 4 or 5 years and then followed them up for a few years. So the initial results only started appearing in 2004, 5, 6, and 7. The accrual of the patients was begun in 1997, and it was done over 2 or 3 years, and all these patients were followed up for at least 5 years. So you can see here that the number of cases in each was more than 400. So the COLOR trial was colon resection lap or open. So that was the acronym color. That's how it was discovered. That's how it was named. And similarly, the COST trial was also based on clinical outcomes of the studied tumor groups. So that was the acronym COST trial for the American trial, where the lead author was a lady called Heidi Nelson from the Mayo Clinic. And the color trial was pushed by the Swedish group. So also it took centers from all over Europe, in Germany, France, Belgium. There were many countries which participated in the color and COST trial. So these are the two most important trials to begin to tell us that it was actually safe to do it. The conversion rates are mentioned here. The initial trials, the conversion rates were quite high. As you can see in the the later trials, the conversion rates dropped to 1.2 to 10%. The follow-up was more than 80 months, and the disease-free survival and the overall survival at 5 years was very similar. There were no port site recurrences, difference between open and laparoscopic groups. And in the color trial also, all the colon surgery patients. So you can see that at 5 years, there was a clear non-inferiority established. So there was no superiority of laparoscopic surgery, but the safety, efficacy, and feasibility of doing laparoscopic surgery and achieving the same results with much better scarring, recovery to work, etc. In these patients. So these two trials established that you could do safe laparoscopic surgery for cancers too. Later on, the classic trial, which was published in the Lancet from the UK, the Korean trial, which was included colon and rectal cancer, and the Color 2 trial published by the same European group, which included both colon and rectal resections, published as recently as 2017. So these two trials also then went on to include patients who were had also rectal cancer. The initial thought was that laparoscopic surgery for rectal cancer may not be that easy, and rectal cancer was excluded. But in the subsequent two trials from the same groups, the Color 2 and Korean, were including rectal cancer surgeries also. And those trials have also shown similar results. So here I can show you in the rectal cancer surgery also, the Color 2 and the Korean trial published in 2015 and 14. You can see that the local recurrence rates and the disease-free and overall survival rates were very similar. In fact, if anything, there was a slight advantage, which is not significant in the laparoscopic group over the open group. So all these trials now establish that you could safely and effectively do both colon and rectal cancer surgery with very good results at 5 years in terms of the oncology. So this actually led to an explosion of laparoscopic surgery in all GI cancers. And if the patients are well suited to laparoscopic surgery, then that's really always the first option in these patients. So that was the important step in the hurdle initially, which was thought to be that there would be port site recurrences and it would cause spillage and all kinds of problems with laparoscopic surgery. These 3-4 big trials established that it was safe. These are some other meta-analysis and systematic reviews which tell us that large studies with more than 3,000 patients, there was a clear benefit of laparoscopic surgery in terms of shorter hospital stay, shorter length of surgery, shorter length of complications like abdominal abscesses, deep vein thrombosis, paralytic ileus, intra-abdominal infections. So these also showed a 30-day readmission date and reoperation date was similar in the two groups, with a significantly lower surgical wound infection rate. So it was, it clearly in conclusion showed that lap surgery was comparable to open surgery in terms of post-operative outcomes for right-sided colon cancer. Also, more complex parts of the operation like laparoscopic lymph node, lateral lymph node dissection in rectal cancer, which is thought to be a difficult part of the rectal cancer surgery, that also in when you do a laparoscopic lateral lymph node dissection, that could also reduce morbidity and reduce hospital stay after rectal cancer surgery. Surgical site infections, a large meta-analysis only looking at surgical site infections clearly showed a lower wound infection rate and lower intra-abdominal abscess rate in patients who had undergone laparoscopic surgery compared with open surgery. So then we tried to move on to a robotic surgery. So although laparoscopic surgery has been extensively studied, it's still underused. In America, still only around 28% of colon cancer surgery is done laparoscopically. For example, laparoscopic gallbladder surgery would be 98% in America would be done laparoscopically. Colon cancer surgery has still not reached that level because there is a steep learning curve for this technique. So people feel that if you use robots for doing laparoscopic colorectal surgery, that might reduce the learning curve because it is more similar to doing open surgery. Unfortunately for India, the problem is that there is a huge cost which is additional to doing robotic surgery in these patients. There is a problem of time. It's very time consuming, and there is a lot of equipment required, which is also expensive. So there are a lot of difficulties in trying to do these laparoscopic surgery in robot assisted if you try to do it in India, because there is a huge problem of cost. So in terms of evidence, there are many studies now, especially in rectal cancer surgery, because there is a clear advantage of robot assisted laparoscopic surgery for rectal cancer, and many units which are doing large amounts of rectal cancer work in America and Europe have slowly moved from laparoscopic surgery to robotic assisted lap surgery for rectal cancer, because in the pelvis there is a clear advantage of the robotic manipulation and it makes it much easier to handle the lower rectal stump and do a pelvic node dissection in these patients. So so there is a clear, if you have a patient who's got a rectal cancer and is suitable, they are ideal candidates for robotic. Coming to more advanced methods like single incision lap surgery. Now, single incision is to try and further reduce the number of scars on the abdominal wall. And this has been especially found to be useful in patients who have got lesser surgeries like appendicectomy or cholecystectomy. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any improvement in the patient's recovery time. And there is a worry, especially in gallbladder surgery, that you can actually land up with more bile duct injuries with single incision laparoscopic surgery. So in those areas, the single incision surgery is actually fallen into disrepute, or it is not often used. However, in colorectal surgery, fortunately, and in obesity surgery, single incision laparoscopically has been developed and thought to be now as good or better than patients who have got multi-port laparoscopic surgery. So here you can see in this systematic review, you can see that if you are using with the complete mesocolic excision and colectomy for colon cancer, there are potential benefits of a SILS. Similarly, if you use a single incision laparoscopy versus standard laparoscopy for colorectal surgery, for right-sided tumors, there is a clear advantage of reduced hospital stay and reduced wound infections in single incision surgery. The one which has been clearly proved to be beneficial is right-sided colon surgery. So there are lots of meta-analysis and reports of improvement in patients' recovery and discharge and reduced hospital stay in right colon surgery, which is done through a single incision. Lastly, the final frontier of notes, where you do the entire surgery. That means you can do the entire operation through a single orifice, either transvaginally, transrectally, transorally, where you have absolutely no scar on the abdominal wall. It creates a visceral incision instead of a skin incision. So if you put in your instruments through the vagina or through the rectum and make small openings onto the rectal wall and introduce your instrument into the abdominal cavity and do the entire operation through one of the viscera, through a visceral incision, you can have absolutely no incision on the abdominal wall and do a completely scarless operation. However, this is still in a very experimental stage, because there are a lot of potential disadvantages. You're going to make an opening into the colon or the rectum or into the stomach or into the vagina, and you can imagine that to create a pneumoperitoneum and to work in that environment through a very tiny scar inside the abdomen, the instrumentation that is required and the advanced instrumentation that is required is not yet been developed for this, and it's very much in the experimental stage. But that is perhaps the holy grail of minimal access surgery, to have a completely scarless operation. So in summary, I would like to say that minimal access surgery has been demonstrated to be safe and feasible, with very good long-term outcomes and much improved short-term outcomes. Similarly, minimally invasive surgery for rectal cancer, though not definitively determined in the last 5 years, the results of ongoing multi-center randomized controlled trials will give us conclusive answers, but there seem to be clear benefits so far in the literature that rectal cancer surgery also can be safely done both laparoscopically and robotically, with as good results in the long term and much better results in the short term. And as it gains popularity, some innovations that will overcome the current laparoscopic surgery limitations may further improve their results and make it easier for surgeons to use it. It's very important to understand that many of these patients in India may not be suitable for it because of cost reasons or because they present late. So you have T3, T4 lesions in the colon which are not suitable, and you'll have a disaster if you rupture the tumor on table while dissection, and you may convert a potentially curative disease into an advanced disease. So it's very important that the surgeon chooses the right patient to do a laparoscopic surgery. Patients who have got distended abdomens or who come with obstruction, these are not patients which may be suitable for doing laparoscopic surgery. And in fact, you may make things worse than what they already are. So thank you very much for your patient hearing, and we'll be ready to take questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nilesh. This was an extremely informative and concise talk on all the minimal invasive therapies that are present, and I hope we can use more and more even in our Indian setting. I thank you very much once again.
No, thanks everybody, and thank you once again for this kind invitation.
So we move on to the last topic of the day, and I will be giving this talk on palliative care. So we've heard all along about all the new innovations, new techniques whereby we are improving the survival rate of the patients. What we have also now to talk about is the quality of life of these patients. So as we've already heard that colorectal cancer was initially seen more in the Western countries and with a very high morbidity and mortality rate. And unfortunately, because of change in lifestyle in our country too, we are now seeing a very high rate of colorectal cancers. We have already heard that traditionally surgical resection has been the primary stay of the treatment of this thing. And since they present in a late or metastatic setting, it is very important to have a multidisciplinary approach with a pivotal role played by palliative care. So when we are talking about palliative care, what are we talking about? We are talking about improved quality of life, not of just the patient, but also the entire family. We've also seen that it results in better treatment compliance, and because of that may even offer a survival advantage. So coming to what is palliative care, and this is where I would like to spend a little time on the definition and this thing, because it's a very misunderstood term. Very often, most doctors and even general public think that palliative care is only given at the end of life. That is not the case, because as per the sheer definition goes, it is only an approach which improves the quality of life of not just the patient, but the entire family facing any life-threatening illness. Most cancers come into that category, through prevention and relief of suffering by means of early identification and impeccable assessment and treatment of pain, and not to forget other problems apart from the physical problem, which are psychosocial and spiritual. which also leads me to another definition of what is health. So very often we think of health only as a physical problem, but once again, the WHO has defined health as a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of a disease. So just removing the disease, by that, you are not really treating the patient. One more thing that we can talk about, and it's a sad observation, that when we are talking about quality of life, we've often forgotten about the quality of death index. And this has come to the forefront more so in today's current era of the pandemic, where our quality of death is unfortunately ranked very, very low. And in 2015, when Lancet did a report, we, India, ranked roughly around here, which we were among the last 15 countries in the world. So to improve all this, this thing is to address suffering at different stages. And by doing that, it has to be a multidisciplinary approach. We have to not forget the psychological, the social, the spiritual, and different problems which affect the patient and the family. So apart from the disease per se, there are many things which the patient goes through. So the approach of palliative care is optimal palliative care can be given in advanced colorectal cancers also. It's a complex and challenging process. It has to be a multidisciplinary interventions, as we've already mentioned. Palliative care can improve all the phases of the disease, and it is not necessary only at end of life or in a last stage. And it also allows in better decisions in the end of life care. So it prepares the patient and the family to approach the end of life. Again, talking about it, it is multidisciplinary, and this is the terminology. So whether you want to call it supportive care or you want to call it symptom control, it all basically is the same thing, and it is used to improve the quality of life of the patient. So again, going back to its roots, we have been introduced to the concept of palliative care by Hippocrates himself. And in the more, as we approach the more modern era, Cicely Saunders, Dame Cicely Saunders was one of the pioneering person, and she was the one who first started the modern hospice concept. And this was started in 1967. Later on, it has approached in India too. And the Shanti Avedna was our first palliative care, this thing which was started in 1986. So again, approaching all the different aspects, physical, emotional, spiritual, and not just for the patient, but of the entire family, remains the goal of palliative care. So when we are talking of palliative care, we are managing the symptoms, we are looking at the psychosocial care, so we are providing the patient with counseling, and we are also supporting the caregiver and communication, which is the mainstay of palliative care. So it has to be an open-ended discussion. It has to be patient-centric. It has to be the choice of the patients, because we know that we have so many different options in treatment today, but it is what the patient really wants at the end of the day. So talking about, again, coming back to colorectal, we can be seeing initial symptoms of mild anemia to bowel obstructions, which can become a pretty serious thing. And in extremes, two main situations are considered: the asymptomatic, which is, or minimally symptomatic, and the severely symptomatic, where the patients need aggressive management, including emergency cases. And this would also include options such as surgery or palliative chemotherapy. Again, so yes, this is what we were talking about. And I think Dr. Dabar has described in detail about, in a metastatic setting also, how chemotherapy and different targeted drugs today can be used for the patient. And although the setting is palliative, it is not done with a curative intent, it can be yet considered. And emergency management of colorectal patients will always remain high, because the morbidity and mortality is high, as we have seen already. So the things that we see very often are obstruction, massive bleeding, In these cases, yes, we do need, again, surgical interventions as colonic resections or the stromal bags, etc. Perforations are also often seen. And other symptoms such as the ascites, which can be managed by tapping of the ascitic fluid. And and in extreme cases, we can also consider palliative sedation when the patients are not put through pain and discomfort and instead are given an easy end of life or a relatively comfortable end of life experience. So aggressive care is definitely not seen as a is definitely not seen as a good quality for cancer services. So you have to evaluate the patient's quality of life always. By just going aggressively on the treatment, we are really not helping the patients. Despite the frequency of symptoms and the limitations of anti-neoplastic therapy, oncologists often do not see the end, and they should refer the patients to a palliative care specialist. And it is necessary to change the role of the physician. And here, even the general physician's role comes into play, where we can create a referral system where they can take care of the symptomatic treatment of the patients. So again, the more commonly seen symptoms such as the burning sensation near anal areas can be treated by local applications or tablets such as gabapentin. Pain, typically going according to the WHO step ladder, we can start with antispasmodic drugs, paracetamols. Neuropathic pain can be treated by gabapentin, then going on to the weak opioids or the strong opioids as may be necessary. Nausea, vomiting are very often seen in colorectal cancer patients and can be treated by pantoprazole or domperidone. The colostomy care is another very important part of patient and symptom management of colorectal cancer cases, because it has to be done, and this can be done with good nursing care. And this talk on palliative care and the importance of palliative care has also been reported and has by evidence-based medicine. So if we see this retrospective cohort study, including all the patients who even died of colorectal cancer between 2004 and 2012 in Canada, provided the better evidence that early palliative care involvement is associated with decreased odds of dying in hospital and lower healthcare utilization and costs in patients with colorectal cancer. So with early communication, and if you treat the patient better at home with home management palliative care, it reduces the hospitalization rates, and it has been established by a study. Once again, in 2016, a meta-analysis evaluated 40 palliative care patients and concluded that this care was associated with improved patient quality of life and control of the symptom burden. So going on to more evidence, ASCO has already integrated it into their practices that early palliative care should be integrated into most oncology cases. And lack of qualified, the problem here remains the lack of qualified palliative care physicians and the access to palliative care. But again, coming to most big centers now are recognizing the needs of palliative care, and NGOs like us have also recognized the need for palliative care. And we have a different models of palliative care which are coming in. And also because it's an interdisciplinary care model where you require nurses, you require psychologists, the pharmacists, you require, and you have to always remember the patient has to be at the center of all this care. The autonomy has to remain with the patient, and it can be then the patient can be helped with all these different people around him. And once again, where can palliative care be given? It can be given anywhere. It can be an OPD setting. It can be admission in a ward. It can be in a hospice where it's mostly the end of life care which is treated there. or most commonly, which is preferred today, is in the home setting, and especially in countries like us, where economic conditions are not very good. Home care seems to be really the best option for patients today for palliative care. Again, coming back to the COVID situation, this is another place, area where palliative care has come into the forefront, where patients, like even whether they are newly diagnosed or already diagnosed patients who are on therapy, are finding it increasingly difficult to approach their doctors. The symptoms have to be addressed at home, the fear, the anxiety of separation, the social and the financial issues. All this can be taken care of with good palliative care resources. So a network or a working together of the physicians along with the palliative care physicians and the palliative care groups should be a must, especially in the oncology setting. And the therapy should be feasible and optimized. And in Bombay, at least, we have a network of palliative care doctors and organizations whereby we do help a lot of patients who are situated within the city of Bombay. Coming back to a little bit about us and what we do, we have a center called OnCare, which is situated in the Masina Hospital. It has a very therapeutic feel and it really comforts the patients. We have an OPD, a daycare, and the facilities that we provide are, we have palliative care physicians, we have counselors, we have physiotherapists, occupational therapists, colostomy, because we are talking of colorectal cancer more so, nutritionists also, which help the patients go through this difficult journey. We give it an extremely holistic approach by introducing different programs such as yoga, art therapy, music therapy, mindfulness, nutritional support, group counseling, because it works as a support system. So we have support groups where patients going through the same disease can talk to each other and learn from each other. So in conclusion, colorectal carcinoma is a frequent entity with many patients, and mostly since they are diagnosed in a metastatic setting, the recurrences are high and the disease is difficult to treat. Although a fraction of the patients may undergo resection of metastasis with curative intent, the vast majority will remain eligible only for palliative care treatment modalities, which, even though if it is surgery or systemic antineoplastic therapy, the treatment is done only with a palliative intent. Fundamentally, the practice of palliative care concludes an impeccable control of symptoms, good communication, and psychological emotional support for the patients and their families. This extends even to the bereavement care which the families are given post the demise of the patient. And the demand for palliative care to be integrated throughout the cancer trajectory is a must, and it should be combined with limited palliative care workforce means. The palliative care in most academic centers is available, but it also works well. Okay, so Dr. Nilesh, there is a question for you. Yeah, so
yeah, I've just seen that question. It's future
what is the future for laparoscopy surgery? Yeah, and robotic surgery.
So that's a good question, because one of the things that you mentioned was that there's a lot of patients who come with with advanced disease. So as progress is made in early diagnosis and treatment of this cancer, more and more patients will come with disease which is in the earlier stages. And in such patients, laparoscopic surgery is ideal, because they're suitable for laparoscopic surgery and they will benefit from doing minimal access surgery. So the future is very bright, because it's likely that patients will become more and more amenable to treatment earlier than later, which is a sad situation at the moment. So if you saw even in the trials that the patients who were operated in the West, there was an 80% 5-year survival. So you can see that even the disease-free survival in the Western populations of colorectal cancer is very high. And I'm hoping that we reach that level at some stage.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Nilesh. Dr. Dabar, are you there? Because there's this question about bevacizumab has been there. Somebody else has also asked about this in the COVID-19 context. He has answered it for somebody else. And I can just read that answer. So it looks like from a small studies that bevacizumab improves oxygenation, SpO2, FiO2, and radiological improvement as well. However, we do not have any personal use of drug in COVID patients. So he's answered that for somebody else also. So I think that basically answers the question.
And if you want family screening is also another question, I can answer that.
Correct, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, that's a good question again. So people say that around 15 to 25% of colorectal cancers are familial or they are inherited cancers. And there are specific criteria and specific genetic ways to determine whether these cancers are familial cancers or not. And the syndromes described, the commonest ones are what is known as the Lynch syndrome, or the hereditary non-polyposis cancer syndromes. Right. So in these patients, since we are now doing MSI, which is microsatellite instability, and MMR, that is mixed match repair genes, we are analyzing these in all these patients. So if you have patients where there is a mutation, then in those patients, surveillance in the family or screening of the family would be important. The second area is if you present with the colon cancer below the age of 50, there the family screening is important. Thirdly, if you have you are the second or third family member who gets a colon cancer, there again the screening of the siblings and of the children is very important. Then there are certain other conditions like autosomal recessive genes like which cause adenomatosis syndromes. There's familial adenomatous polyposis, FAP syndromes. These are also familial. And if you have one index patient in the second decade, you must start screening the family members at the age of, before the age of 20, because they get colon cancers and adenomatosis quite early on. So these are the 3 or 4 settings in which familial polyposis, familial syndromes for colon cancer are common. And it's as many as 15 to 20% of patients who present with colorectal cancer. So it's important to take a history in detail of these patients and do a genetic analysis, which is anyway required for giving appropriate chemotherapy in these patients. So family screening is a very, very important part of colorectal cancer screening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nilesh, once again. Which is the best method to screen? I think that answer has also been already given. And as a physician, whom should we suspect for high risk of colorectal? I think Dr. Nilesh has just answered both these questions too.
Yes. So, in one word, the answer is colonoscopy. Colonoscopy is the best method to screen for patients in the family. There is no lesser screening method. So people used to use stool occult blood to screen. That means if your stool is positive for blood, then you have a colonoscopy. And there's a new test which is coming up from the Mayo Clinic, which tests for DNA in the stool. And if that is positive, then you can go for colonoscopy. But the best way to screen family members if there's a high risk is routine colonoscopy, which is done every 2 to 5 years.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Nilesh.
Thank you.
Dr. Dabar, since we see you again, there is a question. Please elaborate immunotherapy resistance. If you can give it in a nutshell and in a small answer.
Immunotherapy resistance is when the immunotherapy stops working. Any treatment when it stops working, we call it as a resistance. So immunotherapy resistance is very difficult to outline because many times, the immunotherapy takes a very long time to work. It may take sometimes months and months to work. So immunotherapy resistance is when I would think of immunotherapy resistance when the patient is clinically and radiologically deteriorating. And at least after a gap of 3 months of therapy, that is the time I would consider immunotherapy resistance. There is something like pseudo-progression that may occur when the disease has very rapidly spread over a period of first 2 to 3 months on treatment. That is pseudo-progression.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Davar. I think these questions have all been answered. So I think we by and large, answered most of the questions. So once again, I'd like to thank the faculty, all the speakers, Dr. Delnaz, Dr. Baman Davar, Dr. Nilesh Doctor, for taking time out of your busy schedule and being with us today. And I would like to thank our supporters, which is RPG Life Sciences and Alchem, for all your help and support for this particular webinar. So thank you, everyone. And last but not the least, all the participants, of course, thank you very much for attending this webinar. And I hope you have learned something from it. So thank you once again.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.